Hey, everybody, welcome. So glad you're here with us tonight. We have a very special guest tonight. His name is Rainer Shea. He's an anti imperialist journalist, writer, political analyst. We're really glad to have Rainer with us tonight. So I'm going to put on the closing or the opening music, and then we'll have Rainer. We're going to have a conversation here tonight, myself and the great Rainer Shea.
Of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just it's a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
All right, and here is Rainer Shea. Welcome, Rainer. How are you?
I'm having a nice, relaxing day, continuing with my usual work, getting ready for the next semester.
So you're out in California, from what I understand?
Yes, I'm on the coast of California, and it's beautiful here. I love the weather. The thing is, my part of the world is going to experience a great earthquake at some point in the coming decades.
Wow.
I'm going to have to prepare for that. I've been preparing for that to a great extent for a while now, and I'm anticipating the ways that it's going to shake up our political situation or economic situation. During the time when I'm going to be waiting for the services to come back on, I'm going to be cut off from the internet, and that's something I think a lot of people should know, because my departure is going to be abrupt. But don't fear for me. I'm going to be continuing with my work in another form. I plan to write a book called Reindustrializing America.
Interesting. So I haven't heard. So the area that you're living in California is anticipating a big earthquake?
It's going to be potentially as big as the 2011 Japan earthquake, 9-point scale.
Wow. And I mean, how big of an area will be affected?
It's going to be from southern Canada to here.
Wow.
Although it could set off something bigger. It could set off the San Andreas fault line, and the entire west coast of the United States is going to be impacted by something at least as severe as what Turkey and Syria have experienced this year.
Wow. Well, it's funny, I've been in an earthquake twice in my life. The first time was in 2008. I went out to Los Angeles to help comrades build a Stop War Against Iran demonstration. And we were doing something in the afternoon. And so I was sleeping in, and I thought I was dreaming. And the room was shaking all of a sudden. And I was like, am I dreaming? And they're like, no, we had an earthquake this morning. I'm like, oh, okay. They said it happens every so often out in LA. I'm just like, oh, okay. And then the only other earthquake I've ever been in was right before the Occupy Wall Street protests started in New York City. We had a hurricane and an earthquake in the same week in New York City. And I worked at an insurance firm. And all of a sudden, the room was shaking. And I was like, what's going on? And the boss is like, all right, everyone get out of the building. So we got out of the building. And then my boss, he got his stopwatch out. And he started the stopwatch because it's an insurance company. So they know exactly how the insurance would cover injuries. So if any of us went back into the building and been injured within the time of the earthquake, then the insurance wouldn't cover it. So we all had to wait while he counted on the stopwatch because he knew the exact law because it was an insurance company. So those are my two earthquake stories. Have they had earthquakes before out where you are?
Oh, yes, I've lived through a couple. So far, they've only been 6-point something. Nothing like the epic event that is going to be happening within, I think, the next couple decades, because none of these earthquakes, none of these epic Cascadia quakes in the history of the last 10,000 years of seismic activity have happened more than around 350 years apart from each other. And the last one was in 1700.
Wow. So, Rainer, how did you become a communist? What is your background? I mean, of all the things I've been hearing about you for years. I heard that you were in the Socialist Party at one point. I heard that you were defending People's Korea and defending China, and you've been on my radar screen for at least half a decade, probably longer. So, how did you get started on this rabbit hole? Where did all of this come from? Why did a young man like yourself decide to become a revolutionary anti-imperialist?
As is the case with many people, it started with Bernie Sanders.
Okay.
It started simply with being introduced to socialism as something good. And from there, I was able to radicalize towards Marxism-Leninism, first by unlearning the reformist absurdity that truly makes up Bernie Sanders' ideas. And I found out that Sanders had been promoting the new Cold War against Russia that fully alienated me from him. After that point, I was kind of politically homeless, and this is in 2018. I was politically homeless essentially, so I was redirecting my energy towards fighting against the Syria psyop mainly.
Oh wow, yeah.
Briefly,
Standing in solidarity with the Syrian Arab Republic against the USA funding the rebels and stuff. Yeah.
Yes. The first nominally socialist formation that I came into contact with was the Socialist Equality Party with World Socialist website. Then I realized those people are to an extent wrong too, because they're Trotskyists and they're anti-Stalin. And at that point, and this is wild to think about now, at that point, I still hated Stalin. I still hated Kim Jong-un like the majority of Americans do, because I uncritically believed every atrocity narrative that I've been told about them. Then I came into contact with people, and this is in early 2019 now, who continue to love Stalin, love Mao, love the Kims, love China. And instead of reacting with hostility towards these people, I thought, well, why do they believe what they believe? Why do these people exist?
And who were these people you came in contact with?
I don't remember. No. I do remember one person quite clearly. A person who taught me that North Korea is actually a wonderful democracy is named Shane Lawrence Pick. And I'm always going to be grateful for him for teaching me that.
Where did you meet him?
I met him on Facebook, I think, simply
Okay.
asking questions about the true nature of People's Korea.
Okay.
The problem is, this year he reacted to my Gerald Horn polemic by making fun of me, like so many others have. And he reacted to my coming out in support of Rage Against the War Machine by calling me a red-brown alliance person. So this actually speaks to a problem that I was wanting to get into in this interview, which is there's a large contingent of people on the left in this country who are nominally Marxist-Leninist, yet as soon as the conditions escalate and everybody is forced to pick sides, they side with the wrong camp. They, in effect, side with the Democratic Party.
They're left in form, but right in essence, I think, is a phrase that I've heard a lot. Left in form, but right in essence. It sounds revolutionary and all of that, but then when the rubber meets the road, when the actual conditions, when stuff starts actually happening, suddenly they're on the wrong side. I know somebody else said that, there's a lot of communists that are for the revolution unless it actually happens, and then they're against it. They're for communist revolutions as long as they don't actually happen. I don't know if you ever heard that expression before, but it's a common critique of, middle-class intellectuals and such, that they like the communist idea in this kind of intellectual way. But whenever it starts to actually come into being, they find some excuse to side with the government or the ruling class or the imperialists against it. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes. Well, there are plenty of people who fit that description. There are plenty of people like this who have that class background, but I think what is an even more alarming issue is that there are plenty of them who even have backgrounds within the working class, who are just regular people who could have easily gone down my path. And the reason why they've decided to start attacking anti-imperialist actions at this critical juncture within the class struggle is not necessarily because of their class interests, but because they've gotten involved with cults. Cults that weaponize social justice ideas to get well-intentioned people to act against their own self-interests. These cults, and when I talk about cults, I don't mean that in the bourgeois liberal anti-cult way that you talk about in your book, Where is America Going? I mean that in the way of a group of people who are so passionate about what they view as a fight for justice that they're able to be led towards counterproductive activities. They're able to be led to believe that the majority of the anti-NATO movement in this country should be discarded because of real or perceived contradictions.
Yeah, well, speaking of that, John McCarthy says he used to read a lot of your articles quoting Caitlin Johnson. John McCarthy is a CPI member in Chicago, so he's giving you a shout out. And if anyone else has any questions or comments they would like to ask me or Rainer, go ahead. Super chats are appreciated. We're on YouTube now, and we're on Facebook as well, live streaming. But yeah, when you talk about, I mean, that's an interesting point of analysis. You're talking about cults that kind of manipulate people's emotional experiences, people's resentment. Is that kind of what you're getting at? That they play on I don't know. I've compared it a lot to anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism historically, I mean, it means hatred of Jews, but in a lot of cases, it was weaponizing working class people's resentment against the middle class, because they can see the middle class. They can't see the ultra rich, the big bourgeoisie, but they can see the lawyer who lives down the street, or the shopkeeper in their neighborhood, or their own landlord. And that, that the middle class, because they own their own store or their own practice, or they own some land or whatever, they have a different relationship to the means of production and a different outlook on life. And the middle class tends to be more socially liberal than the working class. The middle class tends to, they tend to have more money, but they tend to be tighter with it because it all goes back into their business, right? They're not getting a paycheck every few weeks. And a lot of the stereotypes historically that have been aimed at Jews are stereotypes about the middle class. And anti-Semitism was a tool of the capitalists to whip up, working class resentment against the middle class. And it wasn't about offering any real solution. It wasn't about like making things better or making things fair. It was just about stoking up that rage and resentment. Isn't it unfair that this happened? Aren't you mad? Aren't you mad? And that wokeness kind of follows the same trope as anti-Semitism. It doesn't get you mad at the ruling class and the ultra rich. It gets you mad at people in your life who have it slightly better than you, because they're white, because they're male, because they're not LGBT, because they, have some form of privilege. And it doesn't offer a real solution. It just is about telling you you're allowed to be angry, cultivating your rage and resentment toward that person in order to weaponize it. And that's a historical parallel I've made, that wokeism is kind of similar. It's a similar kind of, psyop as anti-Semitism. What do you think of that?
You are allowed to be angry at a middle-class person only justifiably when they've done something that's actually reprehensible. Because there are plenty of middle-class people who join the fascist movement.
Sure.
The problem is there's an effort in these circles on the left to portray anything that's not approved within these left spaces as being necessarily fascist.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the word fascist gets bandied around quite a bit nowadays. I think, and if everyone's a fascist, pretty soon nobody's a fascist. You know what I'm saying? Like it's a little bit weird. What is your definition of fascism? Because I've noticed that's the thing that Marxists tend to disagree a lot about. What do you see fascism as?
Well, after reading your book, I view fascism as a practice. I did used to engage in the fallacy of thinking fascism is only ever a theory. Fascism can only ever have ties to the things Hitler and Mussolini wrote. But yeah, now that I've seen your analysis, I do agree that fascism is a practice wherein the ruling class, or a ambitious element within the ruling class that's trying to seize power, weaponizes certain social scapegoating mentalities to try to fortify the bourgeois order.
Mm, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, and I mean, fascism is the natural path of capitalism in a crisis. When capitalism enters a long-term crisis, fascism's the only way they can stay in power and not have a revolution, not just have society completely collapse. It's kind of the natural path of liberal Western capitalist societies in a long-term economic crisis. I mean, that's just the way that they move, and that's why communists are the best anti-fascists, because we say you don't have to have capitalism. We can move beyond capitalism. We can move to something higher. So we really present the only real alternative to fascism. Now, a lot of the people who may align with us may not feel that way, but at the end of the day, and that's what we saw during the 1930s with the Popular Front. The Communist Party positioned itself as the center of anti-fascist resistance. And that led to a lot of great victories for the working class around the world. And it led to Eastern Europe, having socialist revolutions. It led to China, driving out the Japanese invaders and eventually having a socialist revolution. It led to the formation of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. I mean, there were a lot of great events. The Battle of Cable Street that happened in 1936, where Oswald Mosley, the fascist who was trying to seize power in Britain, was defeated by, a heroic working class mobilization. I mean, there's many examples of that. The Communist Party entered a strategic alliance with Roosevelt against fascism, and that won Social Security and unemployment insurance and a lot of the benefits that we now have today. So, yeah, I mean, opposing fascism, nothing wrong with that. I'm absolutely in favor of opposing fascism, but I don't think we can necessarily say that all conservatives are fascists. I think that's where I think a lot of these anti-fascists today have kind of lost it.
Yeah, you got to engage in a material analysis. You got to judge things for how they truly are. It's a useful tactic to call anybody who opposes you a fascist. If you obfuscate these kinds of definitions, though, well, that's going to have bad consequences. And we're seeing those consequences. We're seeing how so much of the left has been won over towards attacking the majority of the anti-NATO movement. I mean, there's a reason why the CPI is a member of the World Anti-Imperialist Platform. There's a reason why you've continued to be accepted among so much of the anti-imperialist movement domestically and worldwide. There's a reason why people like Scott Ritter have been such powerful forces within recent discourse. Is because when you align yourself with the historically progressive forces worldwide, you're going to attain a kind of power that the reactionary elements, by which I also mean these NATO-aligned leftists, are never going to be able to achieve.
Yeah, well, that's one thing that I have noticed about some of these NATO-aligned leftists is that they see Nazis everywhere except in Ukraine. I mean, they see, Trump supporters are Nazis, leftists who disagree with them are Nazis, railroads are Nazis, people that record songs that they don't like are Nazis. But in Ukraine, there's these people marching with torches, putting up monuments to actual Nazi collaborators like Stepan Bandera, tearing down the monuments to the people who defeated the Nazis. Right. I mean, and they're not Nazis. I mean, it's weird. And they go, oh, they're not Nazis. Zelensky is Jewish, so that can't be. Right. And you're just like, there's actual Nazis in Ukraine, actual Nazis right there. And they don't notice them. But everyone else, it's like everyone else, they've got some kind of, Da Vinci Code secret sign interpretation to find a way that they're a Nazi. But then the actual Nazis that are right in front of their faces, they just dismiss. It's a bit of a double standard, isn't it?
Yes. Yes. And, again, this is something that plenty of these individuals that I'm talking about are able to recognize. It's not like the PSL, for instance, can deny that Nazis exist within Ukraine. But they have been doing something troubling. PSL's Brian Becker has been minimizing the reality of Nazi influence within Ukraine.
Oh, I didn't realize that. This is Brian Becker, the leader of the Party of Socialism and Liberation, which is the big communist group that runs the Answer Coalition. I just want to make that clear for viewers. But you're saying that he's been minimizing the presence of Nazis in Ukraine?
He's been arguing that because the Nazis have been declining in their parliamentary influence within Ukraine in recent years, that makes the justification for Russia's intervention within Ukraine less credible. And, you know, this is, of course, to justify PSL's taking the stance that we don't support Russia's action. And this is totally misleading. They don't talk about, PSL does not talk about the unelected junta that truly rules Ukraine from behind the throne.
Yeah.
The reason why a Jewish president, right after being elected, has become complicit within Ukraine's existing Nazi policies is because they could assassinate him anytime they want. If he were to rebel against them, they'd simply pick him off and replace him with somebody else. That's the institutional reality of corrupt states. I mean, haven't we known this for decades? You just have to look at the Kennedy assassination to know that this is how corrupt states work.
Yeah. Zelensky was elected on a peace platform. He was going to implement the Minsk agreement and make peace with Donetsk and Lugansk. And as soon as he got into office, he realized the president of Ukraine doesn't really have the power. NATO has the power, and the fascist elements within the military have the power. And that he's now doing the exact opposite of what his, campaign was all about, because he doesn't really run it. And that's the wild thing, is that in American media, there's all this talk of the USA. The USA is invading the sovereign country of Ukraine. Ukraine is not a sovereign country. Their sovereignty went away in 2014 when the United States toppled the government and installed, hand-picked leaders. And Victoria Nuland was caught on the phone picking who the next president would be. Yeah, I mean, it's particularly wild, but the Party of Socialism and Liberation, the PSL, they are, they're a very big party. And if you look at what they believe on paper, you would think that they're this genuine revolutionary party, that they've got ties to Cuba. They talk a game about being friendly to People's Korea and all of that. But if you actually get in contact with them, you get a very different story. Has that been your experience with the PSL?
Yes, I was involved in the Peace and Freedom Party for a few years, which would be good if the Peace and Freedom Party were what it used to be. PFP has decades-old roots. It was highly relevant during the civil rights era. It worked with the Black Panthers. Then only in the last decade, since the PSL came into being, it's gotten taken over by PSL and turned into a front for that org. PSL acts quite authoritarian in objectively bad way, because authoritarianism is just a tool. It acts quite authoritarian towards all of the orgs that work under it. And it tries to leverage its influence to push out anybody who has deviating views. Towards the end of my experience with PFP, it was getting tense, because here's the interesting thing about the Ukraine war. The Ukraine war represents a huge escalation within the geopolitical and class conflict. It represents a catalyzing event that is forcing many people to pick sides. And the side that I picked was with Russia, with Russia's anti-imperialist actions specifically.
Yeah.
As soon as I started arguing in favor of those actions, I started getting pushback from the people within PFP Humboldt who had taken on an unpaid role as an attack dog. They were telling me that I was breaking democratic centralism, but what part of the PFP's constitution says that it needs to obey PSL uncritically? PSL had created this weird relationship with all of the PFP branches, where if anybody deviates from the PSL's beliefs, they're now suspect, and they need to be targeted.
Yeah, so the Peace and Freedom Party is like an electoral party in the state of California that has a ballot line. And you're describing how the Party of Socialism and Liberation, which is this communist group, has kind of effectively taken control of this group and pushes out people that don't agree with it. That's what you're describing, right?
Yeah, they're a communist group in the same way. Well, they're not quite as bad as the Second International, but they're comparable to the Second International in that they have reacted to an escalation in the anti-imperialist struggle and the class struggle by siding with the wrong people. The PSL has reacted to this escalation by deciding to disavow Russia's action in Ukraine, and thereby has effectively gone back on its previous pro-China statements, because this action that Russia has carried out is greatly assisting with the PRC's global ambitions. It's because of Russia's action in Ukraine that the Belt and Road Initiative has been getting stronger than ever, that so much of the world has been suddenly siding with China, whereas prior, a lot of the world was still iffy on that.
That's a good point. That's a very good point. It's made Russia and China much closer, and the USA has tried to isolate both of them, and has in response tried to escalate the situation on Taiwan. In response, right? Do you want to talk about the situation on Taiwan?
I used to think that Taiwan was going to be the proxy war that followed Ukraine, but now that the Ukraine proxy war has failed, things have been getting more interesting than that. I now view Taiwan as something that the imperialists are going to use instead as a reserve. Because it's clear that if the imperialists were to try to replicate the situation in Ukraine and Taiwan, they would get defeated in an even more humiliating way.
Wow.
Now I believe that the primary front within the new Cold War is shifting towards Africa, shifting towards BRICS. Because a hybrid warfare campaign against BRICS is now the backup plan of the imperialists. And they're increasingly going to be shifting towards that. And now with Africa's rebellion, with the actions by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the imperialists are pivoting towards Africa as one of their primary locations for waging war.
Yeah, and Russia is escalating its friendship and support with African countries. That's one thing that I've noticed recently. There's been a lot of coverage, a lot of statements made by Putin, a lot of dramatic moves are being taken. Like RT is opening studios in Africa. The grain deliveries, all the countries that lost out on grain shipments because of the Ukrainian war, getting their grain delivered. All the African countries by Russia free of charge completely. I've noticed that Africa seems to be increasingly relevant, and African countries largely will not condemn Russia at the United Nations. So I've noticed that as well. The African countries, they tend to abstain. They tend to refuse to vote against Russia. So Mariah, one of our people here who's on the stream, says, I'm a Patreon of Rainer's. I have mentioned to him that the revolution will likely not come from the left. Oh, what do you say to Mariah?
The only leftists who are going to participate in the revolution are the ones who've been willing to engage in the self-reevaluations that I've been engaging in. Because for a while, I was not willing to work with you, with CPI, with the majority of the anti-NATO movement, because I was too stuck within the PSL's backward mode of practice. And the left, sure, it's aligned with some of the most socially enlightened ideas, but unless somebody is being serious about anti-imperialism and class struggle, unless somebody is building the alliances necessary to defeat the state, they're not going to win. And whatever they say about social justice, racial justice, all these left causes, it's ultimately empty. The revolution is not going to necessarily come from the left. It's going to come from, whoever's down for it.
Yeah, well, the Rage Against the War Machine, I think, was a very big test moment. There have been a lot of moments that have really just kind of shown where people are at because, at Rage Against the War Machine, there were a lot of leftists like the Center for Political Innovation, like the Party of Communists, like Jimmy Dore, Chris Hedges, many leftists supported it. But all of these fake leftists, the PSL, the World Socialist website, all of them, it was like they made it sound like it was a crime. I think Jason Unruhe, Maoist Rebel News, claimed the rally was a right-wing terrorist gathering. That's the word he used, which I just thought was hilarious. Like, I mean, anyone who was there that day knows that is not what it was, and it was like you would have thought like all we did at Rage Against the War Machine in DC is like burn crosses and commit hate crimes all day or something. I mean, that's how they practically described it. And it was like, of all the rallies that have ever happened, I've never seen so much hate unloaded on a rally by the left. But there were a lot of leftists who went to it. And CPI, we had a great reception afterwards for Scott Ritter because Scott Ritter was going to be one of the speakers. And then within the Libertarian Party, there was just this huge demand from libertarians that he not be able to speak, even though many libertarians wanted him to speak. And so finally, Scott Ritter agreed to just step down and step out of the rally. So he did. And then a lot of those libertarians who were mad that he was there, like Spike Cohen, they didn't go anyway. So, it was a little sketch, but then Scott Ritter, he wasn't able to speak at the rally. So we had a reception for him afterwards in downtown Washington, D.C. And we filled up an auditorium full of people in this hotel. It was, we were all chanting Scott, 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 Scott. And it was standing ovation for Scott. He gave a great speech about the danger of nuclear war. It was really great. Another moment that really tested the left was the murder of Dari Dugina. Right? Because it's like, I've met Alexander Dugin before, and he's not a Marxist. I mean, he has a worldview that is, I don't know. I mean, it's conservative, I would call it. He's a conservative Russian traditionalist. His daughter, who I met several times, very nice, kind person, shared his worldview and was involved in, trying to promote, patriotism and love for her country and coordinating with people around the world who liked Russia. She would always, when I was in Russia, she'd come and visit me at my hotel, take me to dinner. We'd talk about the class struggle in the United States, different political forces, and she was very well educated about Marxism and economics. And she was brutally murdered, by a car bomb. I mean, it was horrendous what was done to her. This is a young woman who's not even 30 years old, was murdered by a car bomb by the Ukrainian fascists. And that was a big moment where she gets murdered. And so many of these leftists who claim to be anti-imperialists were cheering that this one because her worldview is not a Marxist one, because she wasn't a communist. Right. And I was just horrified by that. I mean, it's like, if you're anti-imperialist, how can you be cheering for the foot soldiers of the imperialists, the fascist foot soldiers of the imperialists murdering a young woman like this? It was utterly horrifying. What was your reaction to the death of Dari Dugina?
Well, I honestly just took example from types of commentary that I saw from the kinds of people who were being reasonable about it, because I think Ben Norton was one of the people who wasn't being reasonable about it.
Not at all. Yeah, he was saying he would spit on her grave. He went on this whole tirade about he hates Dugin and everything Dugin stands for. And it's like, even if you have strong objections to Dugin's work, not the time, bro, not the time. You know what I mean? Like, it's what's the thing they say? It's too soon. It's too soon. Like, just talk about how sad it must be for the family. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, but what were you saying? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. You mentioned Ben Norton.
Ben Norton. Yeah, that's one of the things that made me stop and think for a second. And I don't think this was conscious at the time, but I may have been reevaluating some of my allegiances. Because why would I want to ally with people who react to murders carried out by Ukrainian fascists in a way that really seemed sympathetic towards Ukrainian fascism, however much they'd say they're anti-Nazi.
Yeah. Well, we got another question here. This is Piha. He says 2019 independent article about Zelensky failing troop pull on front line near Zoloty. Not long ago, after Verkhovna Rada got in office because of Azov Regiment, also video on VZ's Facebook. I don't know what that means. Do you know what that means?
Hmm. Well, it does seem like they're speaking to what we were talking about
Okay.
how the Ukrainian state is corrupt. The fascist militias have a fundamental kind of control. And if we ignore this reality, then we're just going to be repeating the arguments that the Democrats and the NATO partisans make. Because they want to cultivate the perception that Ukraine represents democracy and freedom,
Mm,
Russia represents totalitarianism and evil.
mm,
And I wouldn't say I've seen any Marxists, self-proclaimed Marxists who believe that, but the kinds of rhetoric that they promote is definitely compatible with that. I mean, I will see people make whatever excuse that they can to deny the progressive historical nature of Russia's action in Ukraine. When I really started confronting PSL in particular about the opportunism of its stance on Ukraine, and this happened in spring after the PFP situation got too bad for me to remain in there. After I no longer owed anything to PSL, I started calling it out for its opportunistic stance on Ukraine. The people that I knew who remained PSL partisans, um, I think, made up the excuse that PSL just doesn't support Russian counter revolution. That no, their
mm.
concern isn't about uh, loving Ukrainian Nazis. It's about Russia's counter revolution of 1992. And sure, PSL isn't pro-Nazi, but it doesn't seem anti-Nazi consistently either. And you have these Marxists who promote a purity fetish argument to justify disavowing the most anti-Nazi action that's been taken so far in the 21st century. What does
Bingo.
that say about the mentalities in the primary parts of the US left?
Yeah, well, one of our CPI members was in Boston, and they went to a PSL event about the war in Ukraine. And at the event, PSL was actually vocally supporting the so-called peace movement in Russia, which is the most pro-American, pro-Western, pro-free market people that have been protesting against Putin. And our member actually pointed out, and they said, well, actually, the communists in Russia are the biggest supporters of this intervention that Russia is doing of the denazification, special military operation. And these young people, the peace movement, they're the most pro-Western and pro-American. And the PSL members, they had never heard this before. They had no idea that the Russian Communist Party had wanted Russia to send its forces in back in 2014 and has been calling for this for 8 years to happen. They had no idea, right? In their minds, they thought that the Russian peace movement and themselves were on the same team. They thought that the Russian Marxists were in this so-called peace movement. It's being backed by the American government. It was kind of sad to listen to, that they were just so tuned out from what the global communist movement is saying. Does that surprise you?
They have no incentive to pay attention to what international communists believe. They have no incentive to research what the DPRK's position on Operation Z is.
Mm-hmm.
They certainly have no incentive to research what Burkina Faso liberation movement's position on it is, because the movement behind the effort that the Burkina Faso general has been carrying out, the anti-colonial actions, that movement is quite pro-Russia. They've been carrying out pro-Russian demonstrations,
Mm-hmm.
and that's something that the U.S. left altogether ignores because at their core, they want to tail the Democrats. They're afraid of turning off too many liberals. And Russiagate solidified American liberalism's anti-Russian orthodoxy.
Yeah, well, Piha followed up. He said, Verkhanova Rada is a Ukrainian parliament. Mark Sloboda pointed out many far-right politicians in VR went to different parties to rebrand for the 2019 election. That was Piha following up. So do you have anything to say on that?
It sounds like they're arguing that there are a lot of crypto Nazis in Ukraine that we're not hearing about.
Mm.
And if that's true, then Brian Becker's argument has no backing whatsoever, because he's basing it off of the idea that support for the Nazis has been declining in Ukraine's parliament in recent years.
Yeah. One thing I've been completely telling, over and over and over again, telling people is that, if you want to know the communist position on Ukraine, look at what every single communist government in the world is saying about it. China supports Russia. North Korea supports Russia. Vietnam supports Russia. Laos supports Russia. Cuba supports Russia. Venezuela supports Russia. Nicaragua supports Russia. Belarus supports Russia. There is not a single communist government, that doesn't support Russia in this war. Whereas, there are people that call themselves communists in non-communist countries, like, the Communist Party of Greece or the French Communist Party. The French Communist Party supported the invasion of Libya and the overthrow of Gaddafi. They support the French government bombing Mali. And that there are many communists in Western countries who take the bad position. But all the actual communist governments in the world, every single one, if it's a communist government, Nicaragua supports Russia, right? Every single Marxist or communist government that is actually in power supports Russia. And it's beyond me how people cannot notice the glaring contradiction there. Like, why should you listen to some professor in America or in France or in Germany rather than listen to the revolutionaries who have actually taken power and are actually creating a socialist society? It seems to me that the ones who've actually won and are creating socialist societies should be listened to ahead of people who write books, and study the Frankfurt School and write new papers about Judith Butler and Theodore Adorno. Western Marxism is not who we should be taking our cues from, and that just seems like common sense to me.
It's American exceptionalism of the
Yes.
left variety, and this isn't just about Russia. It's also about which strategies are necessary for winning power in this country, because within every historically successful revolution, it's involved getting the armed forces behind the effort. And there's another common idea within the modern American left that we should exclude armed services members, or at least not carry out any efforts towards winning them over, because it's a purity fetish mentality again.
Yeah, well, I got to tell you, one person that I really look up to, and it was really just an honor to have known him, was Andy Stapp. Have you ever heard of Andy Stapp?
Oh, never heard the name.
Andy Stapp, I was in the Workers' World Party for many years, and Andy Stapp had been in the U.S. military during the Vietnam War, and he formed something called the American Servicemen's Union. It was like an attempt to unionize the U.S. armed forces. And he was sent to military prison for doing this, and he had thousands of GIs who joined the American Servicemen's Union. And they had a newspaper called The Bond that they distributed many thousands of copies of all over the world at U.S. military bases, urging U.S. soldiers to support the Vietnamese. He had a New York Times obituary when he died. Andy Stapp was a real hero, if there ever was one. I can play a clip of him, but one thing about Andy Stapp that also just kind of shows you what a badass this guy was after the Korean War was over, he lived in North Korea for a couple years, and they set him up on the DMZ, right? And they put speakers on the DMZ, and he would blast messages to the troops, the American troops on the other side of the DMZ, urging them to lay down their guns and come over to North Korea. So he was quite a badass, and he eventually became like a history teacher in New York City, and he eventually died. He had lung cancer, and he died. I went to his memorial, but he was an older guy who was kind of an inactive older member of the Workers' World Party when I was around it. It was really an honor to know Andy Stapp, and that the anti-war organizing among soldiers was a really important part of the anti-Vietnam War movement. That was essential. If you want to stop the war, get the soldiers to stop fighting. We should be actively trying to recruit, the military to an anti-war movement. So the idea of anyone who's military, we should just shun them and say, "Oh, get away from me. The military's bad." That's just delusional. I know during the Vietnam War, the Progressive Labor Party They would march with their red flags and they'd chant, "Soldiers, turn your guns around, shoot the generals to the ground." That was their chant that they would use. I'm not sure, that's a little bit ultra left, but that was the atmosphere, is they wanted to recruit soldiers to the anti-war movement, and all over the U.S. military during the Vietnam War, soldiers were refusing to fight, and they were refusing to fight. They were, going over to the Vietnamese. That happened. You had American GIs who defected. I mean, that was a big, spreading opposition to the war within the U.S. military was one of the greatest things. And that's why they hate Jane Fonda. A lot of anti-war, a lot of Vietnam vets have it in their head that Jane Fonda is this bad person. That's because Jane Fonda, she did like a road show. She actively went around the country, around the world trying to recruit GIs. She had this show she did called FTA, which stood for Fuck the Army. And she tried to get American GIs to not fight in Vietnam. So yeah, you're absolutely right about that. These people that have it in their minds that recruiting soldiers is a bad thing, or you're a bad person if you'd want to recruit the soldiers. That's absolutely wrong. Do you agree?
Yeah, the way that these types of people justify taking these positions is by claiming to represent the only correct iteration of anti-colonialism. At least that's been my experience with them. And there are people who, like we've acknowledged, have legitimate trauma, whether personal or historical. People who have experienced things that we can't really relate to as people who have not historically within our families been on the receiving end of colonialism. And that's why I was able to be persuaded by their arguments for so long, because they have experiences that I don't necessarily have as a white guy.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're gonna listen to everything somebody says just because they're a part of a certain identity group, then you're not really being honest with yourself. And you need to be able to criticize anybody if they've gone astray.
Yeah, just because someone's oppressed doesn't mean they're necessarily right. I mean, it means they've experienced oppression. It means that they can speak to their own experience. But, I mean, a lot of people become oppressed and it makes them criminal and violent. A lot of people become oppressed and it makes them drug addicts. You know what I mean? Trauma doesn't necessarily make you a better person. In some cases, it can make you a stronger person, but not always, and that's a mistake I think a lot of leftists fall into. They assume, well, if someone's more oppressed than me, they must be right in the argument. Not necessarily. Trauma damages people, right? And that people who have seen trauma are the first to tell you that. But I'm going to play this clip of Andy Stapp for you, and then we got another question, I think from Mariah. But there we go. We'll put on Andy Stapp.
Yeah, I need to get a drink.
All right, here we go.
Have you ever asked yourself why we have had increasing trouble with discipline in our armed forces? Listen closely to the chairman of the American Servicemen's Union, and you will understand.
Okay, I'm going to run down some stuff tonight about the GI revolts and rebellions that have been going on in the U.S. Army over the last year, the organizing drive that we're undertaking. But before I do that, I got something real important here. Korean people have asked the American Servicemen's Union to send their greetings to the revolutionary young people in America. And they sent us a letter, which I'm going to read. Dear Andy, our thinking is that the ASU and the People's Korea will combine efforts in chopping the head off U.S. imperialism. Will combine efforts in chopping the head off U.S. imperialism and tearing its limbs in concert with the revolutionary people the world over, in mutilating the U.S. ruling circles, fully supporting the ASU. You will readily agree with us in this respect, I believe. Yes, right on. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea is the banner of freedom and independence of our people, and also a powerful weapon of building socialism and communism. Your contributions will greatly encourage the Korean people in their struggle to achieve an independent, peaceful unification of the fatherland, accomplishing the complete victory of socialism and communism. The ASU is playing a leading role in this fight, in this organizing drive. We have chapters of the American Servicemen's Union on 60 large military installations in the United States and 40 overseas. Just as the Bolshevik Party organized through the Soviets in 1917 against the Tsar and the oppression in Russia, the American Servicemen's Union is organizing Soviets within the U.S. imperialist army. The only line that's going to lead to victory, and revolution is a proletarian line in the army. And they know that whoever can command the allegiance of the rank and file troops, that command is going to be decisive in revolution or counter-revolution. And right now, the American Servicemen's Union is building an army within an army, a workers' militia inside the U.S. Army. And along with the Panthers and others, we're going to make that revolution. Power to the people.
Yeah, so that was Andy Stapp, a communist who heroically organized within the U.S. military during the Korean War. What did you think of that clip?
It really inspired me. It really vindicates a lot of what we've been saying, because I've seen you clearly talk, whether it's implicit or not, about how American communism was quite successful during the early 20th century, up into the 60s and 70s. But at some point it got co-opted, it got chopped down. It's not today that we so much see things like that, though there are examples of people who've been involved in the imperial structure and have now defected to a better place, like Scott Ritter, and they're continuing the tradition. But back then there were so many prominent individuals who were able to shape American discourse, shape American consciousness in a revolutionary direction. But in the 60s and 70s, here's what happened in the 60s and 70s. The Frankfurt School started to propagate their anti-revolutionary pseudo-theory that sought to replace class with identity. And then the FBI successfully defeated the Panthers. Then the USSR was destroyed, and that allowed for an American equivalent of perestroika with the CPUSA's full assimilation into reformism and revisionism. And those were the three big events that really destroyed American communism. Now we're trying to rebuild it.
Yeah. All right. So Mariah asks, can Rainer talk about the gang stalking program, COINTELPRO, plus what's happening to dissident voices and how it's escalating? So what is the gang stalking program? I'm not familiar with that. What is that?
Oh, if I hadn't met Alexander Finnegan, one of the dissidents who I've been in contact with, I would have thought that the gang stalking program is all made up. Because the first thing I heard about gang stalking is that it's a conspiracy theory propagated by people with paranoid schizophrenia online, and they're telling each other about that and reinforcing that delusion. And it seems like there are some people who are in that situation, but gang stalking is a real thing. I know this because Alexander Finnegan, a communist who has spoken out against Ukraine and been targeted by this program in retaliation, has told me about it. It's a horrific practice where the FBI, using something called InfraGard, systematically harasses and stalks people. The goal is to psychologically wear somebody down by sending in harassers who have plausible deniability. It sounds so bizarre, but that's the only way to describe it. Like he said that he's heard gunshots outside his house at night, stuff like that. He said that he's had his social media accounts hacked, and they used that to send him 2 videos and this is Alexander Finnegan talking. He wrote this to me. These two videos, one of them included LA gang members who threatened his family, and another included a Ukrainian hit squad that threatened him in a similar manner. This is what the FBI is doing to anybody, well, not anybody, who speaks out. They're trying to make examples out of certain people, and that's the only reason why not 100% of us have experienced this.
Well, it's interesting when you describe gang stalking, because I mean, one thing that I've been dealing with for years, I mean, past 3 or 4 years, I've noticed that anywhere you post a video of me or an article that I wrote or an interview that I do, whether it's Reddit or on a YouTube channel or anywhere, Facebook, immediately right below it, there's like 5 posts that just magically appear. This guy's a fascist. This guy's a Nazi. Don't believe anything he says. Oh, he's bad. You know what I mean? You know what I'm saying? And I've noticed that. And that has to be like the work of like an artificial intelligence bot, because I don't think there's people that care that much. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I've got a small YouTube channel. I've written some books and all that, but I don't think I have like actual people that are sitting there seething going, oh my God, I'm going to monitor YouTube to make sure. You know what I'm saying? I feel like there's bots that do that. You know what I'm saying? Because I don't feel like anyone has the time to stalk me online and make sure that anywhere I go, I get this tag, these personal attacks. And I think you've probably experienced similar things. Is that gang stalking?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, there's definitely been a psyop of some sort against you because you are a major counter-hegemonic voice. And, in modern America, that doesn't mean as much as it used to, but it means that people like you and me have potential to seriously change the mass consciousness, and that makes us threats, potential threats. They want to stamp out the seed. And the way that they try to do this with Alexander Finnegan, this is a really wild story. Last year, they decided to artificially raise him up within the Quora community and then suddenly tear him down so that they could portray him as a deranged individual who was making up stories in his mind about being gang stalked. And the goal was to discredit Marxism, Leninism, and anti-imperialism by extension. Now Alexander is living with his family in Guatemala. That's the only country that he was able to get to. And he says that he still hears gunshots outside his house there.
Yeah. Now, John McCarthy says gang stalking is why Susie Dawson sought asylum in Russia. Who's Susie Dawson? I'm not familiar with that case.
Never heard that. I never heard that name. I believe it.
Yeah. No, I mean, the harassment, it happens, right? And, weird stuff happens. And, and a lot of it, the main thing you don't want to do is you don't want to draw too much attention to it, right? I mean, weird things happen in your life and all of that. The main thing is to just focus on, well, first of all, don't do anything illegal, right? Because then they'll put you in jail because they're obviously watching you. That's the one thing, right? So, I don't even drink alcohol. I mean, that's legal. I'm over 21, but I don't use drugs. I don't do anything illegal. You got to be honest on your taxes, things like that. And then the other thing is you just got to ignore it because they're doing it with the intention, whatever it is, they're doing it to intimidate you. You know what I'm saying? Like weird things happen. When I was, a teenager, like, before I'd ever done anything political, I was a teenager. This was like early 2000s after 9/11. I started subscribing to the RCP, the Revolutionary Communist Party's newspaper, right? Just because I was interested in communism, whatever. So, and after I'd been doing that for about a year, a Time magazine subscription started showing up at my house, which we never had subscribed to Time magazine. But in the place of the name, instead of having my name or the name of my family on it, it said the name was Follower of Bob Avakian, right? And that's like intimidation, right? That's the government saying to you, like, we know that you're reading the RCP newspaper, and we want to kind of intimidate you, right? And that's supposed to make you paranoid and flip out. I just thought it was funny. The funniest thing that I thought was, they kept sending this Time magazine subscription to our house, which we'd never paid for. It said Follower of Bob Avakian rather than our name on it. And my mom got tired of it. So she called up Time magazine and she asked them to stop sending the subscription. She said, there's no one here, and so they said, well, what is the name on the subscription? And my mom said, Follower of Bob Avakian. And the woman on the end of the line said, is that your husband? Is your husband Bob Avakian? So, my mom was not impressed. But it was kind of funny, actually. But it was like, that's kind of a gang stalking type thing, right? Is that, that was clearly some kind of intimidation. Somebody somewhere, the FBI or whatever, had noticed that I was subscribing to the RCP newspaper. So just to put me on notice, they gave us a subscription that we never got, and they do things like that, right? And I think that's kind of what gang stalking is, right? It's like little things like that. And if you do this kind of revolutionary work, you'll notice stuff like that. It happens, right? It happens, right? And it's par for the course, right? And it's intimidation. It's to make you nervous. It's to make you paranoid, right? It happens, but you just got to keep doing what you're doing. You just got to keep organizing peacefully, legally, spreading awareness, educating people, not get intimidated. And also, there are some people who just, these kind of things are a test, and I mean, if they think it's bad now, I mean, wait until an actual kind of revolutionary situation happens, And so, I mean, if you can't handle getting weird magazines sent to your house, or, people starting rumors about you, or people, saying nasty things, right? If you can't handle that, you're not going to be able to handle the revolution. So the main thing is to just try to focus on getting the work done and not being intimidated. But yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't heard this term gang stalking before. Thanks for sharing about that. I wasn't familiar with that. But yeah, that's an important contribution. Well, we've been going for about an hour, Rainer. Is there anything else that you'd like to add before you go? Anything else you'd like to share?
The conflict in Ukraine has taught us a lot of things. In addition to those things it's taught us about the American left, it's shown us that in order to win, you can't just be reactive. You need to be proactive, whatever that means in your context. Because Putin thought that he could prevail by reactively trying to defend the Donbass region from Ukrainian fascism, U.S. imperialism for 8 years. But at a certain point last year, when Ukraine started increasing its shelling of the Donbass by 400%, clearly an invasion was underway, invasion carried out by fascist Ukraine towards these autonomous regions. Well, autonomous, they were partly controlled by Russia, now they're fully controlled by Russia. The point is, they should not be living under fascist Ukraine, and they should have self-determination. And they should not be ethnically cleansed by a modern Nazi state.
Yep.
And Putin intellectually understood this, but he wasn't willing to carry out the steps necessary for taking away the tools for violence that the fascists had, demilitarize, denazify Ukraine, until last year, when the problem became impossible to ignore.
Well, very good. Where can people find your work, Rainer?
At newswiththeory.com. That's my website. You can also find me on Substack. And I actually prefer you find me on Substack. Look up my name next to Substack so that you can then subscribe to my newsletter.
Oh, well, very good. Well, I'm looking forward to working with you and anyone else who wants to build a real anti-imperialist, anti-war movement in our time. So thanks for coming on, Rainer. We'll be sure to have you back. Next time you write an article or you do something, you want to come on and talk about, we'll have you back on here. You can come on anytime. It's really been a pleasure. So shout out to you and all our comrades in California. Sounds good. Thank you. All right. Have a good night.
All right.